The canyon country does not forgive mistakes. This is the first thing Elias Voss had learned when he rode into the Red Rock Territory 17 years ago, a younger man with a younger man's certainty that the world would accommodate him. The land had spent considerable time teaching him otherwise. It had broken 2 of his horses, 3 of his fingers, and one unnameable thing inside his chest that he suspected had once been called hope. It had taken his water twice and his provisions once, and on a November night that he did not like to think about. It had taken his partner Cal Briggs to a flash flood that came down a side canyon with the sound of a freight train and the temperament of something ancient and indifferent. The canyon country does not forgive mistakes, and it does not mourn the men it takes. Elias had stayed anyway. There was nowhere else that wanted him, and the canyon country, whatever its indifference, did not actively turn him away. It simply presented itself each morning in its terrible beauty, the sandstone towers burning orange and crimson in the early light, the silence so profound it had texture, the smell of sage and iron and something older than both, and let him decide whether to continue. Each morning, he decided to continue. He was 41 years old now, which in canyon years was something closer to 60. His face had been worked over by wind and sun into a topography not entirely unlike the land itself, deep-cut lines, hard surfaces, the occasional unexpected shadow. He was not a large man, but he was a durable one, put together with the kind of economy that suggested no part of him had been included unnecessarily. He rode a buckskin mare named Certain, who had earned her name by being the only reliable thing in his life for the past 6 years, and he carried what he needed and nothing more. What he needed was very little. A bedroll. A canvas tarp. Enough dried beef and hard biscuit for 10 days. A skinning knife, a folding knife, a rifle of respectable age and impeccable reliability. A fire steel. 50 feet of good rope. A battered medical kit that Cal had insisted on and that Elias had blessed 100 times since. A journal he never wrote in but carried out of habit, formed so long ago he could no longer remember its origin. A compass. A water bladder and the knowledge of where water hid in this country, which was worth more than everything else combined. He did not carry a mirror, a calendar, or any item whose purpose was to connect him to a world he had largely concluded was not his. He was following the West Fork of Perdition Canyon on a day in what he estimated was late September, tracking a route he had mapped partly in fact and partly in imagination. The West Fork was not in any registry he had ever seen. It was not on the hand-drawn maps that occasionally circulated among the small, scattered population of men who lived in these territories. It appeared in no survey. It was, as far as Elias could determine, entirely unknown to anyone who wasn't standing in it at this moment, which was only him. He had found it 4 years ago by following a hawk. This was not as mystical as it sounded. The hawk had been following something, and the something had led it along a line of air current that traced, with avian precision, a crack in the canyon wall that widened, 50 yards into a passable corridor. Elias had been curious enough to follow, and curious enough, after the corridor opened into a long winding side canyon, to keep going. The canyon had rewarded him with a seep spring, a protected overhang for camping, and the particular quality of silence that he had come to associate with places that had not been disturbed. He had returned to it several times since. He thought of it, vaguely, as his. He was thinking of the seep spring now, calculating distance and water remaining, when Certain stopped. The mare was not given to stopping without reason. Elias had learned, through the accumulated patience of years, to trust her assessments. He sat quietly in the saddle and let her read whatever she was reading, scent, sound, some register of information that his own senses were too coarsened to detect. Certain's ears moved forward. Not in alarm. In attention. Elias looked ahead along the canyon floor, where afternoon shadow was beginning to pool between the walls. He saw the canyon as he had always seen it, rock and sand, a thread of dried vegetation along what had once been a waterline, the far wall rising in a series of ledges that caught the light at angles that changed by the hour. Juniper clinging to cracks with the particular stubbornness of things that have survived long enough to stop doubting they would. He did not, for a moment, see the woman. Then he did. She was in the shadow of a ledge perhaps 30 feet up the wall, pressed flat against the rock with an economy of movement that suggested long practice at being invisible. She was watching him. He could not make out her face from this distance, only the pale oval of it against the darker stone, and the suggestion of hair, dark and wild, and limbs that were arranged along the ledge with the unconscious efficiency of something that had learned the geometry of stillness. Elias did not reach for his rifle. He did not call out. He sat uncertain and looked at the place where the woman was, letting her understand that he had seen her, and waited to see what she would do about it. What she did was nothing. She held her position with a patience that struck him as unusual. Most people, when discovered in a place they had believed themselves hidden, experienced a burst of self-consciousness that expressed itself in movement, a shift, a straightening, some involuntary assertion of personhood. She did not shift. She might have been part of the rock. After a while, Elias clicked certain forward slowly and continued down the canyon. He did not look back, though it cost him something. He camped that night at the Seep Spring, which offered perhaps 2 gallons of water per hour from a crack in the sandstone, not enough to sustain any great enterprise, but more than sufficient for a man and a horse who knew how to be patient. He built a small fire from the dead juniper that lay in abundance along the canyon floor, and he heated the hard biscuits in a pan with a little water until they were edible, and he drank his coffee and thought about the woman on the ledge. She had been young, he thought. It was difficult to say with certainty given the distance and the shadow and the complete absence of the ordinary markers by which a person places another person in the category civilization has prepared for them, but there had been something in the way she held herself against the rock, a coiled readiness, a fluency with difficult terrain, that suggested someone whose relationship with this country was not recent. Not a traveler who had wandered off a trail. Someone who had been here long enough to learn the rock the way you learn a language, from the inside out. She had been watching him with the focused attention of something that has learned to evaluate threats by observation rather than inquiry. She had been barefoot. This much he was certain of, because her feet had been braced against the ledge at an angle that would have been awkward in boots and natural in bare skin toughened to the work. He thought about this for a long time, watching the fire work through the juniper and turn it to something cleaner. A person alone in these canyons, barefoot, pressed against a ledge 30 feet up a wall. Not dead, which argued for a degree of competence. Not approaching him, which argued for wariness or fear or both. Not fleeing, which was perhaps the most interesting datum of all. Not fleeing argued for curiosity. Elias had survived for 17 years in a country that ate survival errors because he had learned to pay attention to what things argued. What the situation argued now was that he should not ride on tomorrow. What it argued was that he should stay long enough to establish his intentions, which were neutral, and his capabilities, which were various, and his general disposition toward people alone in hard country who had clearly decided the hard country was preferable to wherever they had come from. He went to sleep with this decided and with the sound of the canyon around him, which was mostly wind and the faint negotiation of the fire against the darkness. He spent the next day making himself useful and visible in a way that posed no threat. He repaired a section of his saddle's rigging that had been annoying him for 2 weeks. He gathered firewood and stacked it neatly against the canyon wall near the Seep Spring. He watered certain thoroughly. He mended a tear in his canvas tarp with a needle and wax thread, working slowly with the deliberate focus of a man who has learned that the quality of small repairs is what stands between you and a wet bedroll at 2 in the morning. He made a better camp than he usually bothered with, cleared stones, arranged the fire ring more carefully, positioned his tarp with some architectural consideration. He did not look for the woman. By midday, he knew she was watching him. Certain ears would occasionally orient to some point behind or above him with the casual interest she gave to things that were present but not concerning. Elias had learned to read his horse's attention as a secondary set of senses, and he let them run without acknowledging them. He made an extra portion of food at midday, twice what he would eat, and left it on a flat stone near the fire ring when he went to attend to certain. When he came back, it was gone, and there were no tracks in the sand because she had not walked on the sand to get to it. In the evening, he sat by the fire and did the thing he had not done since Cal died, which was talk. He talked about nothing in particular, about the route he had come from, about the hawk he had seen 2 days past that had been carrying something too large for it with an ambition that he admired, about the quality of this particular canyon stone, which was a different red from the country to the east, more purple in it. He talked about water, and where it was and where it wasn't, and about the Seep Springs' reliability through all 4 seasons. He talked about winter coming, which it was, and what winter in canyon country felt like and what it required and how to know when a storm was building before the sky had made up its mind about it. He was talking to himself, or to the fire, or to whatever part of the darkness had chosen to listen. He went to sleep without looking up. On the 3rd morning, she came into camp while he was at the spring and she was there when he turned around. He stood still. She was perhaps 22 years old, possibly a year or 2 in either direction, because whatever had been her life had built her into something that resisted easy categorization. She was lean but not fragile. There was a coiled quality to how she stood, a distribution of weight that communicated readiness without aggression. She was dressed in what had once been a shirt and a pair of trousers, both of which had been altered by need and time into something that was now simply covering, patched with strips of leather and what looked like canvas and tied with cord in 2 places where buttons and seams had given out. Her feet were bare, as he had noted, and the soles of them, he could see this now in the morning light, were built up into something more like leather than skin, cracked in places, discolored, but clearly functional across the sharpest terrain this country offered. Her hair was dark brown and fell around her face in a state of nature that no comb had addressed in what appeared to be a considerable time. Her face was weathered, darker than its original complexion from long exposure, and her eyes were a light gray that seemed almost startling against the brown of everything else. Those eyes were doing the thing she had done on the ledge, reading him with the full attention of something that has learned that inattention is expensive. Her hands were empty. He noticed that they were capable hands, not soft, built with calluses in places that suggested particular kinds of sustained work. The hands of someone who had been doing hard physical things for long enough that the doing had become structural. "Good morning," Elias said, in the even voice he used for uncertain situations. She did not respond. She was looking at his camp with the same focused inventory she was giving him, cataloging it, and he let her. After a while she looked back at him and said, in a voice that was rusty from disuse and had an accent he could not quite place, somewhere between nowhere and everywhere, assembled from fragments of several origins, a single word. "Water." "Seep Springs back there," he said, with a slight movement of his head that did not involve raising his hand. "Comes out slow, but it comes. Always has, in my experience." She moved past him without further acknowledgement and went to the spring and drank. She did not use his cup or his canteen. She drank directly from the seep with a cupped hand, steadily and without greed, and then she stopped when she had enough and stood and looked at him again. "Are you camped near here?" he asked. "Nothing." "You don't have to answer that." She looked at his pack, specifically at the canvas outer pocket where he kept his dried provisions. The look was not a request. It was an honest communication of a fact, which was that she was hungry, offered without any of the social machinery that usually surrounds such admissions. He opened the pocket and took out a strip of dried beef and a hard biscuit and held them out, his arm extended, not taking a step toward her. She came forward and took them from his hand. Her fingers did not touch his. She stepped back and ate the beef first, then the biscuit, and while she ate she watched him with the same unblinking attention. When she was done, she wiped her hands on her trousers and looked at him for another long moment. Then she left. Not running, walking, in the direction of the canyon wall, and then she was simply not there anymore. Elias stood in his camp for a while after that. The canyon was entirely itself, red and quiet and indifferent, and the morning light was moving down the far wall in the slow way it had, and certain was regarding him with what he had learned to identify as equine philosophical inquiry. "I know," he told the mare. Part 3, The Learning of Each Other. She came back in the afternoon, and then again the following morning, and by the end of a week they had established a commerce of sorts, not friendship, which required more history and more trust than they yet had, but a functional proximity. She would appear at the camp, sometimes at the spring, and he would have food that he could offer without performance, and she would take it without performance, and they would exist in the same space for a while, and this seemed to be sufficient. He learned her rhythms by observation. She was most confident in the early morning and at dusk. She did not like the middle of the day, which was the hottest and most exposed part of the canyon's cycle, and during those hours she disappeared entirely, retreating to some shelter he had not identified. She moved through the canyon with a fluency that he respected, reading surfaces the way he had learned to, choosing rock over sand, shade over sun, the path that left the least trace. She was quieter than he was. She was perhaps quieter than anyone he had ever known. She did not have a name, or if she did, she had not yet offered it. He did not ask. He called her nothing, which was a kind of acknowledgement that naming was her right and not his. On the 8th day, she watched him with concentrated interest while he mended his boot. He had a specific technique for it, a saddle stitch that he had learned from an old cobbler who had ended up in this country for reasons he had not shared, and which produced a seam of unusual durability. She watched every step. When he was finished, she pointed at the leather needle and then at a place on her own covering where a leather patch was pulling away. He handed her the needle and thread without comment and watched her work. She had used a needle before. Her hands knew the tool, even if they had been working without a good one for some time, and she stitched the patch with more care than speed, getting it right. When she was done, she offered the needle back and steadied the stitch with the critical attention of someone who knew enough to evaluate the work. She seemed satisfied. "You've sewn before," he said. She looked at him. "You had someone who taught you." Something moved through her face, not grief exactly, but the shadow that grief leaves when a person has been doing the work of surviving too long to have fresh grief available. She looked away. He left it. He was building a picture of her in the way he built maps, not all at once, but line by line, adding detail as it was offered and leaving blank spaces where information hadn't come. What the picture suggested, she had been part of a human organization at some point, and then she hadn't been. She had skills that had been taught, the stitching, the knowledge of water, the way she read terrain, which was too systematic to have been invented alone from scratch. She was not feral, not in the way the word usually meant. She had not lost language. She was using it, just using very little of it. There was a difference between someone who had gone past language and someone who had decided to ration it. He thought she was rationing it. He thought she was waiting to see if it was worth spending. On the 10th day, she told him 3 things. The first was that there was a water source to the south that he hadn't found. She communicated this not in words but by picking up a stick and drawing a shape in the sand that he recognized after a moment as the canyon system they were in, simplified but accurate in its proportions, and then marking a spot and looking at him to see if he understood. "Is it reliable?" he asked. She held up her fingers, 4 of them. 4 seasons. "Year-round," he said. She nodded. The second thing was that there were 2 men who came through this canyon occasionally, and they were not good men. She communicated this with a gesture that was unmistakably evasive, a ducking motion, a disappearing, and a look in her eyes that was the specific flatness of someone who has been in the presence of genuine danger and has learned not to dress that knowledge up. "I'll be aware of them," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, as if checking whether he had actually understood or was merely agreeing. "I take it seriously," he said. "I've met men like that in this country." She seemed to find this acceptable. The third thing was the valley. She did not tell him about it with language or with a drawing. She told him about it by standing up and looking in a specific direction, not north, not south, but at an angle to the west that he hadn't explored, where the canyon wall looked solid and unpassable, and looking at him with an expression that he took a moment to translate. It was an offer. Part 4, The Kingdom. She led him on foot, leaving certain picketed at the Seep Spring with enough water and grazing to wait, because the path she took was not passable by a horse. Not yet. He followed her along the canyon floor to a place where the wall had fallen, not recently, but in some geological event that had taken its time and left a jumble of house-sized boulders in a configuration that looked, from any direction, like an obstacle. She went through it without hesitation, following a path that was invisible until you were on it, and he followed more slowly, registering the route. The rocks had fallen in a pattern that created, through the middle of the jumble, a corridor that twisted twice and then opened into a narrow chimney that angled upward at perhaps 60 degrees. She went up the chimney the way she went everywhere, competently and without announcement. He climbed it with more effort, finding handholds and footholds that she had not needed to find consciously, working up and over and then up again, until the chimney narrowed and then, abruptly, he pushed through a gap in the rock that was almost too narrow for his shoulders and found himself standing on a ledge. The ledge was 40 feet above the canyon floor and 30 feet below the canyon rim. It was wide enough to stand on comfortably, and it curved along the wall to where a crack in the stone, vertical, perhaps 18 inches across at its widest, admitted a person of moderate width and stopped admitting anything larger. She was waiting at the crack, watching him. "Through there?" he asked. She tilted her head. An affirmation. He turned sideways and went through the crack. It was not a long passage, 10 feet, perhaps 12, but it angled and the rock was close enough on both sides that he had to commit to it, had to press through it in the dark between the stone, and for one moment the kind of fear that has no logic pressed up through him with its cold hands, and then the crack widened and he stepped out of it and stopped entirely still. What he was looking at required a moment. The valley was roughly oval, perhaps a quarter mile at its longest, and it sat in a cup of canyon stone so completely surrounded that it might have been designed. A basin of impossible green in the middle of all that red. The walls rose on all sides, not quite vertical but steep enough to function as walls, curved at their bases into a bowl that held what was inside with a kind of geological intention. Through the center of the valley ran a stream, not a seep, not a thread, but an actual running stream, clear and assured, maybe 5 feet across at its widest and deep enough in places to be dark. The floor of the valley was grassed. Genuinely grassed, a thick, tough, low ground cover in the shade of the walls and longer, more ambitious grass in the center where the sun reached fully. Cottonwoods grew along the stream with the ease of trees that have never been worried about water, and their leaves in this late September light were beginning their turn to yellow, so that they stood in their casual rows like small fires. There were willows as well, and something he thought was wild plum, and below and between them an undergrowth of things that were green and alive and utterly incongruous with the world 60 feet above and a chimney crack away. Animals had been here. He could see the evidence, the worn paths to the stream, the grazed areas, the mud along the bank with its impressed record of deer and something smaller and the long, neat print of a fox. Birds moved in the cottonwoods. He could hear them. He stood at the entry and looked at all of it for a long time. The woman was watching him from a little way inside the valley, standing in the grass with the stream behind her, and she was watching his face. He understood suddenly that she was reading his response, that this was a test, or if not a test, an evaluation, and that his response mattered in ways he didn't fully understand yet. He looked at her. "You found this," he said. She looked at the valley and back at him. "How long have you been living here?" he asked. She looked at her hands. Then she held up 2 fingers. Then she thought and added a third. 2 or 3 years, he said. She dipped her head. Elias turned back to the valley. He let himself see it properly, not as a miraculous accident, but as what it actually was, which was a place. A place with water and grass and shelter and animal life, hidden from every direction by the canyons and different architecture, accessible only to someone who knew precisely where to look and had the ability to fit through a crack in the rock face that a man with bad intentions would likely never find. A defensible position with resources. A kingdom. He felt something move in him that he hadn't expected, and he took a moment to identify it. It was not wonder, though wonder was part of it. It was not relief, though there was something adjacent to relief in it. What it was, he thought, was recognition. The valley and his life had something in common. Both had found their way to a place outside of what civilization considered findable, and had been quietly, stubbornly alive there without anyone's permission. "It's good," he told her. "It's very good." Part 5. What was needed. He did not move into the valley immediately. He did not assume the right. He went back through the crack and down the chimney and through the boulder jumble to certain, and he rode out of the canyon and made a camp in the open country above the rim for 2 days, during which he thought carefully about what he was doing and what it required of him. What it meant to be offered something by someone who had survived this country alone, by her own capability, for 3 years. What she had been through was visible in certain ways and invisible in others. The visible parts were the practicalities, the state of her clothing, the condition of her feet, the economy with which she held herself, the rationing of language and trust. The invisible parts were the other kind, the ones that lived behind the gray eyes and had to be approached carefully if at all. A person alone in this country, surviving for 2 or 3 years. This required a particular set of qualities: patience, practicality, the ability to distinguish between what mattered and what didn't, and something additional beyond all of these. It required the capacity to be fully alone, not alone in the temporary sense, the way he was alone, knowing that there were other people in the general vicinity of the world, but alone in the complete sense, without the knowledge that someone would come. She had done this, and she had found the valley, and she had made herself at home in it, and at some point she had determined that a man on a horse riding through the canyon below was worth watching, and then worth approaching, and then worth offering the kingdom to. He thought about what this meant, about the kind of careful evaluation that led to such a decision. She was not offering him a home. He understood that. She was not offering him any of the arrangements that civilization had words for. She was offering him the valley because the valley was real, which meant it was too large for one person and not too large for two, and because she had read him in the careful way she read everything and had concluded that he was someone the valley could accommodate. He thought that was the most honest and complete form of trust he had ever been offered, and it made him careful in a way he would not have been otherwise. He rode back. The work of the valley began in the way that all real work begins, not with ambition or ceremony, but with what was immediately necessary. What was immediately necessary was a shelter for winter. She had been wintering in the valley, but her arrangements were provisional: an overhang along the south wall, adequate in dry cold but not in the wet cold that came with the canyon country's most difficult months. When the wind came off the plateau and found every gap in the cold was not the clean cold of clear nights, but the grinding cold of moisture and duration. She had been enduring it. Enduring is different from surviving well, and surviving well was what this place deserved. He had knowledge she didn't have, and she had knowledge he didn't have, and the work sorted itself out according to this in a way that required no negotiation. He knew how to build with what the canyon provided. Not the carpentry of towns, with its lumber and nails, but the older construction, rock and timber and earth, the building of walls that worked with the land's existing structure rather than against it. He had learned this from necessity and from a man he'd known for one winter who had been old enough to have learned it from people who had built this way for generations. It was slow work, but it was permanent work, and permanence was what winter required. She knew where everything was. This was not a small thing. Years of moving through the valley had given her an inventory of it that was comprehensive and specific: where the best flat stones were, which could be taken without disturbing anything structural; where the clay lay that could be worked into mortar; which of the cottonwoods had standing dead branches that were dried and cured and ready for timber use without cutting living wood. She knew where the animal paths ran and which hours the deer came to the stream and whether they would tolerate the construction noise. She knew the valley's moods, which sounds were normal and which were not, where the sun reached at each hour of the day and how the wind moved through the basin at different seasons. She communicated all of this in a variety of ways, drawing in sand, demonstrating with her body, leading him to places and letting him look. Occasionally, when precision mattered, in fragments of language. He listened with the same quality of attention he had given to canyon country for 17 years, understanding that paying attention was the form of respect most available to him. The shelter took 2 weeks to build properly. It was set against the south wall of the valley under the existing overhang, extending the natural roof with a frame of cottonwood timber and filling the gaps with flat stones set in clay mortar. The floor was dug down a foot and leveled and covered with a layer of fine sand, then a layer of woven grass mat that she made while he cut timber, using a technique he hadn't seen before and watched carefully until he understood it. The door faced east, which caught the morning sun and lost the prevailing wind. The opening was covered with the heaviest canvas from his tarp, weighted along the bottom edge with stones. When it was done, he looked at it from outside and then from inside and felt the familiar satisfaction of a thing built right, not beautiful in the decorative sense but beautiful in the sense that counted, which was that it would do exactly what it was meant to do. She went in and out of it several times in the days after, in the way she evaluated everything, systematically, not with the enthusiasm of pleasure but with the focus of assessment. He waited. One evening, she moved her things into it. There wasn't much: a rolled hide, a small collection of objects that he had noted but not examined, a length of cord, two shaped stones that were clearly tools. She arranged these with the care she gave everything and then sat in the shelter and looked at him. He took this as an endorsement. They spent October taking the valley's measure. This was her expertise and he was the student, which suited him. He was old enough to have lost the ego that makes learning uncomfortable, and he had spent enough years in canyon country to know that knowledge of a specific place was not transferable. What you learned in one canyon told you what to look for in another, but you had to look fresh every time. The stream was fed from above, not a seep, but an actual underground source that emerged at the head of the valley through a crack in the north wall with a reliability that she had tested over 3 years. It ran the length of the valley and exited through a cleft in the south wall, underground, and he did not know where it went after that. It did not dry in late summer. She had checked this repeatedly, noting the level against a mark she had made on a stone, and the level varied but the stream did not disappear. This was the foundation of everything. Water that could be trusted changed the entire calculus of what was possible. The grass was genuine pasture, not the intermittent, sun-stressed growth of open canyon country, but something that persisted because the valley held moisture and was protected from the worst of the desiccating wind. It was not enough for a large operation, but it was enough for 2 horses if he brought the second horse through. The chimney access would need widening for that, a week of careful work, but possible. There were deer. She had been eating deer, which told him more about her capabilities than almost anything else, hunting alone, processing the carcass, preserving what she could. He looked at her smoking setup, which was improvised and effective, using a crack in the rock and green wood and a timing she had worked out by trial and careful observation. He improved the setup with a modification that added control to the smoke temperature, and she watched this addition with interest and then used it immediately and without hesitation. She had a bow. He found this out when she came back one afternoon with a grouse, shot cleanly, and when he looked at her hands he saw the slight redness on the inside of her left forearm that comes from a bowstring. She did not have the bow with her. He did not ask about it. He processed the grouse and roasted it, and they ate it by the fire in the valley's long autumn dusk, and that evening was one of the quieter and better evenings he could remember. She knew plants. This was perhaps the most comprehensive of her knowledges, the one that had kept her alive most directly. She knew which plants in the valley and along the canyon walls were edible and in what preparation, which were medicinal and for what purpose and in what quantities, which were neither and should be left alone. She showed him some of this in a running demonstration, picking and offering, watching him smell or taste and reading his face for recognition. Some of what she showed him he knew. Much of it he didn't. The medicinal knowledge especially was more detailed than his own, which was the roughened, largely trauma-based medicine of a man who had been managing his own injuries for 17 years. He asked her once how she had learned the plants. He asked it carefully, at a moment when she seemed more open than usual, in the early evening by the stream, when the light was gold and the cottonwood leaves were coming down in the small wind that moved through the valley at dusk. She thought about this for a long time. "Old woman," she said. 2 words. And then, as if memory had accessed more than she intended, showed me everything. He let that sit. "She's gone now," he said. Not a question. She looked at the stream. "I'm sorry," he said. She picked up a stone and placed it carefully on another stone in a small deliberate balance, and he understood this as an acknowledgement. Not of his condolence, but of the loss itself, the weight of it, placed somewhere outside of her body where it could be seen. "She sounds like she knew a great deal," he said. "Everything," she said again. And then, with a slight emphasis that carried what might have been the first thing approaching dry humor he had heard from her, almost. Part 7, The 2 Men. They came in November, when the first cold had arrived and the cottonwoods had finished their gold and gone gray. He had been in the canyon country long enough to hear them before they were close. Sound traveled in particular ways between canyon walls, and the sound of two horses moving without care for quietness came down the West Fork in advance of the thing that made it, as if the canyon was giving notice. He was outside the boulder jumble when he heard it. He went back through the boulders quickly and climbed the chimney and came through the crack into the valley, and she was already standing near the entry, which meant she had heard it too. Her face was very still in the way faces went still when what was coming was known and not good. "The two men," he said. She nodded once. He looked at the valley. It was fully enclosed except for the crack, and no sound made inside it traveled far. The stone held it. Anyone down in the canyon, or anywhere along the canyon walls, would see nothing and hear nothing of the valley's existence. The crack itself was not visible from below or from the rim without navigating a specific formation of rock. The valley was safe. But he had left certain picketed near the seep spring when he came in this morning to work on a project, and certain was down there, and two men moving through the canyon with bad intentions would find one horse picketed at a spring and want to know whose it was. He looked at her. She was already handing him his rifle, which she had moved to a corner of the shelter at some point without announcement. He took it and checked it. "You stay here," he said. She looked at him with a flat, evaluative gaze. "I need to know you're here and safe," he said. "I can't manage two directions at once." A long moment. Then she stepped back. He went through the crack. What happened in the canyon was not complicated, and he did not think about it more than necessary afterward. The two men had found certain and had decided the horse was unattended or abandoned and worth taking, and this miscalculation had cost them time. They had spent it arguing near the seep spring rather than moving on, and this had given Elias time to come down through the boulder jumble and approach them from a position he chose. They were opportunistic men rather than skilled ones, relying on other people's fear rather than any particular capability. He had met their type before in these territories. He came out of the rocks at a distance and angle that made his position clear and their position precarious, and he presented his rifle and his willingness to use it in a way that was not aggressive but entirely unambiguous, and he told them the horse was his and the spring was his and the canyon would not accommodate them further today. One of them considered testing it. He could see the calculation running across the man's face. "I wouldn't," Elias said. The man concluded that he wouldn't. They left. He watched them out of the canyon and then waited 2 hours, because men like that sometimes circled. When he was satisfied that the canyon was only itself again, he went back through the rocks and up the chimney and through the crack. She was where he had left her, standing near the stream with her arms crossed in the particular way that looked like containment but he had come to understand was listening, fully oriented to the world outside through whatever was audible, processing information the way she processed everything. When he came through the crack she looked at him steadily, doing the inventory. "They're gone," he said. "They won't find this place." She looked past him toward the crack, as if she could see through it to the canyon below. "Nothing found. Nothing compromised," he said. Her eyes came back to his. The evaluating. Then something in her shoulders shifted slightly, a release of held attention, not dramatic, just sufficient. "You trusted me," he said. "When I said to stay." She looked at him for a moment. "I know that wasn't nothing," he said. She looked away toward the stream, and he understood that the conversation was complete, that they had exchanged what needed to be exchanged. He went to sit by the fire ring, and after a while she came and sat across from it, and the valley settled around them with its particular evening sounds, the stream, the birds finishing their day, the wind moving across the rim far above. Part 8, the name. It was deep winter before she told him her name. Winter in the valley was different from winter anywhere he had known it. The protection of the walls meant that snow, when it came, fell quietly and without the driven cruelty of open country snow, and it lay on the grass and along the stream bank in a way that was purely aesthetic, beautiful without threatening, because the valley held its own temperature above the worst of it. The stream did not freeze except in the coldest 2 weeks, and then only at the edges, and the overhang kept the shelter dry. They had made the shelter genuinely warm with a heatsink of stacked stones at the back wall, built so that a small efficient fire would charge the stones and the stones would release what they held through the long cold nights. She had understood the principle before he explained it, the old woman, he suspected, or her own reasoning, which he had come to trust as reliable. She added to it a fitted stone that blocked the lower half of the door opening, shaped over 3 weeks with the patient grinding work of stone against stone, and the combination produced warmth that was not merely the absence of cold but an actual positive condition. They had supply. 3 deer processed in the fall. His own provisions, replenished on one trip out through the canyon to a trading post a day's ride away, flour, salt, dried beans, 2 more blankets, additional medical supplies, and a good heavy coat in a size that would fit her, which he left folded on her sleeping place without remark when he returned. She had put it on without comment, and that had been the right way for that exchange to go. The winter settled in and they moved through its shorter days in the way that people who share a limited space learn to move, with awareness, with the adjustments that come from being known. He had learned her rhythms, her preferred working hours, the way she needed to walk outside in the early morning before she was fully herself. She had learned whatever she had learned about him, which was more than he could have articulated because she catalogued things he didn't notice about himself. She had started talking more. Not at length, and never for the sake of filling silence. She had no patience for that, and neither did he. But with the directness of someone who had decided language was worth spending on things that mattered. She would name what she was observing, ask one specific question when she wanted to know something, make a practical statement about a project they were working on that was complete in its economy. He answered in kind. He had told her some things about himself. Cal Briggs and the flash flood. What Cal had been like, generous in a way that was not showy about it, which he said was the rarest kind, and that Cal had known every bird in the canyon country by sight and sound and had been, in consequence, never fully alone. She thought about this for a while. Birds, she said. He paid attention to them. I think they pay attention back, somehow. She nodded. He thought she already knew this. He asked her once about what was before the canyon country. He asked it at night, by the fire, when questions that live in darkness are less difficult than they are in full light. She was quiet for a long time. Came west, she said finally. A long way. With people. A pause. Then not with people. The people left, he asked. She looked at the fire. Sick, she said. All of them. A longer pause. Except me. The fire worked on the wood. I'm sorry, he said. Long time ago, she said. But she had pulled the heavy coat tighter, which told him something about whether a long time was actually long enough. And the old woman who taught you the plants, he said. You found her after? Found her in the canyons. Something passed through her face that he did not try to name. She was alone too. She must have been glad you found her, he said. She looked at him with the gray eyes, and he understood that she had not thought of it that way, had thought of herself as the one who had been found and saved rather than the one who had done the finding. He let it sit and watched her turn it over. What happened to her? He asked, after a while. Winter, she said. One word that covered everything it needed to cover. He nodded. They sat by the fire while the cold worked at the valley outside and the shelter held its warmth against it. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and you don't have to answer. She waited. Do you have a name? A long silence. The fire. The stream outside, moving quietly under its skim of ice. Had one, she said at last. Do you remember it? Another silence. Then, they called me Marin. He said it once, quietly, to hear how it sat in the air between them. Marin. She looked at the fire and did not correct him. It's a good name, he said. Old woman called me something else, she said. Her word. I don't know what language. What was the word? She said a sound he couldn't have spelled, 2 syllables, soft consonants, something that moved like water. It sounds like something a valley would be named, he said. She looked at him. Or a person, he said. She turned back to the fire, and after a while she said, quietly enough that he wasn't certain she meant it to be heard, she said it meant something like stays. He thought about this. Someone who stays, he said. She didn't answer. But she did not move away from the fire, and the fire went on burning. And outside the valley held its winter in the cupped stone hands of the canyon, and the stream moved under its ice, and the cottonwoods were bare and gray and perfectly willing to wait for spring. Part 9. What was built? Spring arrived in the way it arrived in canyon country, not with ceremony but with a gradual shifting of the quality of light, the days lengthening in increments too small to notice until one morning you noticed, and the grass in the valley responded to something happening underground and not yet visible, and the first green started coming up along the stream bank where the moisture was most reliable. By spring he had been in the valley for most of a season, with 2 trips out for provisions. He was thinking about what the valley could be, not in a large sense, because the canyon country had burned ambition out of him over too many years, and he did not think the valley wanted to be anything other than what it was. But in the practical sense. The sense of what 2 people with certain skills and this particular resource could do to be better positioned than they had been in the fall. He talked about this with Marin over several evenings, laying it out in pieces and listening to her responses, which were characteristically precise. She was good at identifying what was unnecessary and had no patience for plans that were more complicated than they needed to be. Between them they settled on a list. The chimney needed improvement so that certain could access the valley. The horse was valuable, and keeping her outside was a manageable risk now, but not in all circumstances. A second shelter was needed for the horse in the corner of the valley where the walls came together and already offered 2 sides. The food supply needed a more permanent preservation setup. And the medical stock needed supplementing. Some of what she knew about plant medicines was not written down anywhere, and he suggested they make it written down. She looked at him when he said this in a way that told him she had not read or written in some time, and he filed this away as a winter project. He had given someone reading and writing once, years ago, the daughter of a family whose mule he had helped out of a canyon, who had showed him her letters with the pride of someone who has been given a key and understands its value. He had not paid enough attention then. He was paying attention now. He started in the evenings, with letters in the sand, following her attention rather than a schedule. She had more foundation than she had indicated. She recognized letters even if she couldn't produce them confidently. He moved at her pace, stopping when the look on her face said the thing had become rote rather than real. She was quick. This didn't surprise him. Everything else about her was quick in this way. She had learned construction techniques by watching rather than instruction. She had adapted every skill to conditions with a flexibility that required genuine thinking. Reading was another version of the same capability. By late spring she was reading his journal, which he had finally begun filling, not for himself but as a record of the valley. Stream levels, first frosts, animal patterns, plant calendars, construction notes. Things that needed accumulating over years to be fully useful. One day he found a note written in the margins beside his description of the valley's entry, the crack, the chimney, the boulder passage. She had corrected his measurement of the chimney. Her figure was right. He read it 3 times with the feeling of someone receiving a gift they hadn't known to ask for. Part 10. The Kingdom's Law. Summer came and the valley was itself in summer, green and watered and alive with the particular abundance of a contained place, the birds busy in the cottonwoods, the deer coming to the stream at dawn and dusk with the regularity of creatures that have accepted the world as reliable in at least this one way. Elias had brought certain through the improved chimney in late spring, a process that had required 2 of the most careful hours of work he could remember. The horse trusting him through a passage no horse would choose voluntarily, moving on his word in the close stone dark. When certain came through into the valley and stood on the grass and looked at the green and the water and the sky above the walls, Elias did not try to name what he felt. Marin had been watching from a distance. She came to the horse slowly and stood at her shoulder, and certain turned her head and blew and accepted the presence, and after a while Marin put her hand on the horse's neck in the particular way she touched things. Not tentatively, not claiming, simply placing her hand there honestly. They established the kingdom's laws that summer. Not formally, there was no ceremony and no articulation of them as laws. They emerged from the way they managed the valley and each other, from the accumulated decisions about what mattered and how to protect it. The first law was that the valley was not a secret kept by concealment alone. The crack could be found. The chimney could be climbed. What protected the valley was the attention of the people who lived in it, always oriented outward, always listening. One of them was always aware of the canyon country beyond the walls, always noting what the bird said and what the horse said and what the quality of the silence said. The second law was that nothing was wasted. The valley made this rule by being finite. The grass, the water, the animal life, the trees, these were not infinite, and the measure of use was the measure of respect. She had been living by this before he arrived. He confirmed it and built it into everything they did. The third law was harder to articulate, and they never tried to say it directly, but it was the most important. It was that they were not trying to make the valley into something else. Not trying to reproduce civilization in miniature, the ownership impulse, the impulse to build something and then defend the having of it. What they were doing was different. They were present in a place and learning it and taking from it only what they needed and putting back what they could, and the arrangement was honest because it was mutual. The valley was not theirs. They were the valley's. He thought about this on a summer evening by the stream, when the light was doing the thing it did in late afternoon in the canyon country, going from gold to something without a common name, a quality specific to here and nowhere else. Marin was 20 feet away sitting on a flat stone above the water with her feet in the current, reading. She was reading a survey of Western plant life he had brought on his last supply trip, checking the book against her own knowledge, revising her understanding or her estimation of the book accordingly. She trusted her own knowledge where it conflicted and trusted the book where it offered something genuinely new, which struck him as the correct approach to all received wisdom. She had grown. Not just physically, though she had grown in that sense too. In the other sense, the sense of a person becoming more precisely themselves. She spoke more freely now, with the same directness she had always had but more of it, more willingness to bring internal things outward where they could be examined. She asked questions that pushed on the edges of what she knew. She argued with him when she thought he was wrong and was right about half the time, which was a better average than most people he had known. She asked him once, on an evening like this one, whether he had ever wanted something different. He thought about it honestly. Different how, he asked. She made the gesture that meant outward, the world that existed elsewhere. I had it different for a long time, he said. Towns. Work. People in the ordinary arrangements. He looked at the canyon wall above them, the light in its best hour. It didn't want me particularly. You didn't want it, she said. He looked at her. Or both, she said. Both, he allowed. It's easier to say the world doesn't want you than to say you don't want the world. She considered this in the way she considered things worth filing. I don't remember wanting it, she said. I was too young when everything changed. The old woman didn't want it either, he said, remembering what she had told him. She said the world out there moved like a river running too fast to see anything. She looked at the stream. I think she meant that something gets lost when everything moves that quickly. Your word, he said. The one she gave you. Stays. She looked at him. Maybe she meant it as a gift, he said. Not a description of what happened to you. A description of what you were capable of. She was quiet for a moment. Someone who could stay, she said. When everything else went. That's worth something, he said. More than you might think. Most people can't. You can, she said. I've had practice, he said. I didn't always choose it. But you stayed. I stayed. The stream moved over the stones and the light moved off the walls and the birds in the cottonwoods did what birds did in the last hour of the day, which was argue briefly and then go quiet, and the valley held them both in the particular way it had, not warmly, not coldly, but honestly, which was better than either. Epilogue, what the kingdom was. Years later, 3, perhaps 4, the winters having accumulated without being counted against any expected endpoint, a man on a horse came through the canyon below the valley and found nothing there. He found a seep spring and the cold ashes of a fire that was very old and a boulder jumble that looked impassable, and he continued south without knowing what was above him. Inside the crack in the rock, above the chimney, beyond the ledge and the narrow corridor of stone, the valley was itself. The stream ran. The cottonwoods had grown in the years since anyone had thought to count them, adding their rings to the record of time that trees keep without witness. The grass was what it had always been, patient, green in the wet months, tawny in the dry ones, returning each spring with the matter-of-fact persistence of things that have been doing this long enough to be confident. The shelter was larger now, extended twice over the years as circumstances required, not expanded out of ambition but in response to specific needs, each addition built with the care of the original, stone fitted to stone with the mortar that the valley's own clay provided. Along the south wall there was a structure of shelves where things were stored, provisions, tools, the medical supplies that had been built up carefully over seasons, and several dozen folded pages covered in handwriting that was angular and decisive and contained, across its accumulated depth, a knowledge of this place that no one else in the world possessed. The stream gauge was a fitted stone with a series of marks on it, the most recent made 3 days ago. There were 2 horses now, grazing along the central grass with the ease of animals that have never had reason to be anxious about their situation. The valley's grass was sufficient and the water was sufficient and the walls kept the worst weather out, and the horses had no complaints. The valley did not know it was a kingdom. It was a place, as it had always been, a cup of stone holding water and grass and the life that those things supported. It had existed before any human had found it and it would exist after, continuing its patient work. What the humans had added was not ownership but presence. The awareness that comes from being in a place and paying attention to it over years. The slight modifications that were tools of habitation rather than assertions of dominion. And the record in handwriting, which the valley did not need but which was a form of acknowledgement that mattered to the people who made it. This place is real. This is what it does. This is the shape of its seasons and the depth of its water in the dry months and the first date of frost and the last and the name of every plant along its walls. The record existed because knowledge unrecorded is knowledge that dies with the person who holds it. And they were not building something to die with them. In the valley, in the evening, in the last good light, the light that came down the west wall and turned everything it touched into a color that had no name but was the color of things that had lasted, a woman who had been called Marin by people who were gone, and Stays by an old woman who had known her well, sat by the stream with her feet in the cold current and read until the light was insufficient for reading. And a man who had come from the world and found himself returned, over the long drift of years, to this, to a fire ring and a spring and a canyon that had given him nothing easy and everything necessary, sat nearby and watched the last light leave the canyon walls without any feeling that it was leaving. The fire would be built in an hour. Supper after that. The night coming in over the rim with its reliable population of stars, which in this valley were not obscured by any light but their own. Tomorrow there was work. There was always work in a real place, and neither of them had any objection to that. The valley was quiet around them. The stream moved. The kingdom stood.